Okay, let's unpack this. That little voice in your head whispering, it's in your genes. When you notice a familiar habit or talent, it's really tempting to think of our DNA as this, like, unyielding script for our lives, isn't it? Like, we're just elaborate biological machines, sort of predetermined from birth.
That notion, yeah, genetic predetermination,
Yeah.
it's certainly held sway for a long time, and it's precisely the territory we're exploring today.
Exactly. And it's all thanks to you, our listener, for sending in Matt Ridley's Nature via Nurture. Seriously, it's the perfect launch pad for this deep dive. We're getting into that fascinating and honestly often surprising interplay between the genetic hand we're dealt and, well, the whole world of experiences that shapes us.
Ridley's work is just so valuable because it really dismantles that simplistic either view,
Hmm.
nature versus nurture.
Right.
He reveals a much more intricate and reciprocal relationship at play.
For so long, it felt like the debate was just stuck, these opposing camps. But what Ridley articulates and what we're going to explore is how our understanding has really, really matured. It's not a competition between the two.
No, it's more like a constant dialogue.
Yeah, a dialogue.
And at the heart of this dialogue are some pretty profound questions about what makes us who we are. Questions about free will, destiny, the very essence of human nature, really.
Absolutely. So your mission, which, hey, by sending in the source you've already embraced, is to gain a richer, more nuanced understanding. How our genes and our environment kind of collaborate to sculpt us. Get ready for some unexpected insights and, fingers crossed, a few of those satisfying aha moments.
What's fascinating to consider right off the bat is our genetic code itself. Remember the Human Genome Project?
Vaguely, yeah. Big deal at the time.
Huge. And when it revealed that we have only around 30,000 genes, way fewer than the 100,000 scientists had initially guessed, well, it really threw a wrench in the works.
Wait, only 30,000? That seems low.
It was a surprise. It certainly challenged that idea of straightforward genetic determinism.
Fewer genes than we thought. It makes you wonder, how does all this complexity arise? But as Ridley points out, even with this seemingly modest number, the potential for individual genetic uniqueness remains absolutely staggering.
Indeed. Think about it. If each of those 30,000 genes just had two variations alleles, the sheer number of possible combinations is astronomical.
Like more than people who've ever lived?
Far, far more. So even with a smaller gene count, the genetic landscape is incredibly diverse. No shortage of uniqueness there.
It's interesting, though, that this lower number didn't cause some huge philosophical crisis about free will.
Right. Ridley uses this clever analogy. If fewer genes meant more freedom, then a fruit fly with its tiny genome would be freer than us.
Ah, and bacteria even more so.
And viruses would be the ultimate agents of free will. It nicely exposes the flaw in that thinking.
Yeah, it does.
And as Ridley mentions, that earlier estimate, the 100,000 genes, it wasn't based on solid evidence.
Yeah.
It was, in his words, just a bad guess.
Which really brings us to this central idea that Ridley emphasizes. Our genes aren't these, like, tyrannical directors pulling all the strings.
Not at all.
Instead, they're in this constant state of interaction, influenced by our own actions, our environment.
Yeah.
It's a two-way street.
This is such a pivotal understanding. We tend to picture genes setting a fixed trajectory, right?
Totally.
But the reality is that gene expression, how our genes are activated or silenced, is remarkably fluid. It's responsive to our experiences.
And this also blurs the lines between concepts we often see as opposites, like instinct and learning. Ridley suggests they aren't necessarily in conflict.
Precisely. Instinct can provide an initial framework, maybe a tendency, but then learning and experience refine and shape how that instinct actually manifests.
Okay.
And what's even more thought-provoking is Ridley's point that environmental influences nurture can sometimes be less reversible than genetic ones.
Whoa, hang on. Less reversible. That really flips the usual perspective. We think of genes as the bedrock, the fixed part.
Exactly. But think about deeply ingrained habits or the lasting impact of early childhood experiences. These can sometimes leave a more indelible mark than a specific genetic variant might. Ultimately, as Ridley puts it so well, nature is designed for nurture. Our genes have literally evolved to be responsive to the environment.
Okay, so to really get how we arrived at this more interconnected view, it's probably helpful to look back a bit, right, at the history of this whole debate. Ridley paints this fascinating, though imaginary, photograph of all the key thinkers.
It's a powerful mental image, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've got figures like Darwin, obviously laying the groundwork with evolution.
Right.
Then Galton, one of the first to try and actually quantify how traits were inherited. James, Pavlov, Freud. They all added a piece to the puzzle.
And it's fascinating how different their viewpoints were. Like, Darwin Ridley mentions his observations of Jenny the orangutan.
Yes, Jenny at the London Zoo.
Darwin saw her intelligence as evidence that human minds weren't some totally separate thing, but part of a continuum with animals.
That was Darwin's core idea. Differences were a matter of degree, not kind. Just like our bodies evolved, so did our minds, from common ancestors.
But not everyone bought that, did they? Ridley brings up Alfred Russel Wallace. He co-discovered natural selection with Darwin.
But he drew a line at the human mind. Wallace felt it needed something more, a different explanation. Maybe spiritual, maybe divine.
Why? Just because we seem so different?
He was struck by the apparent complexity of human consciousness, the big gap, as he saw it, between us and animals. It just didn't seem explainable by natural selection alone to him.
And then you had these really different ways of looking at animals themselves, either seeing them as little furry humans,
Anthropomorphism.
or the complete opposite, seeing them as just machines, pure reflexes. That's the behaviorist approach, right? Watson, Skinner.
Right. They kind of dismissed internal thoughts in animals, just focused on what you could see behavior shaped by rewards and punishments. Exactly. Which created this weird divide where social scientists were often hesitant to draw parallels. Even when someone like Jane Goodall was showing incredible stuff with chimps.
Miki sent her to study chimps to understand us.
That was the whole point. But still, some academic circles resisted applying animal findings to humans.
Meanwhile, philosophers were busy trying to define what makes us unique. Aristotle called us political animals.
And others pointed to reason, language, tools, complex societies. But as Ridley points out, lots of these things have precedents or parallels in the animal world.
So back to Darwin's idea again. Maybe it's about having more of something, or a more developed version, not something totally new.
A difference of degree.
Language is often held up as the big exception, though, the truly unique thing.
It's a common argument, and human language is remarkably complex. But Ridley's counter is that uniqueness itself isn't unique to humans.
Okay, explain.
Elephants have trunks, cobras have venom. Those are unique adaptations, right? So while our language is incredibly powerful, it doesn't automatically create this unbridgeable gulf between us and nature.
So, similar to apes or fundamentally different, the answer seems to be, well, it's complicated. Both, maybe.
It's nuanced, yeah. Understanding the shared history and the unique paths.
Speaking of apes, that genetic similarity between humans and chimpanzees, it's just mind-blowing, isn't it?
It really is. Depending on how you calculate it, we share somewhere between 98.5 and 99.5% of our DNA with chimps.
That's tiny.
As King and Wilson highlighted way back, that level of similarity at the molecular level is pretty remarkable, especially given the obvious differences, our anatomy, our way of life.
I mean, think about it. We walk upright, build cities, have these complex philosophical debates, and chimps are, perfectly adapted for the forest, yet the genes are almost identical.
Well, almost is doing a lot of work there. As Ridley explains, it could mean every single human gene has tiny differences, or that most are identical, but a few key ones are very different. Probably a mix of both.
One clear difference, though, is our chromosomes. We have one fewer pair than apes.
Yes, that's a definite genetic distinction. The thinking is that two ancestral chromosomes fuse together in our lineage sometime after we split from chimps. So we have 23 pairs, they have 24.
And then there's that mouthful of a gene, CMPN acetylneuramic acid hydroxylase.
Right. Active in chimps, but knocked out in humans.
What does it do? Or what did it do?
It's involved in making a specific sugar molecule found on cell surfaces. Varkey's research suggests losing its function in humans millions of years ago might have had knock-on effects maybe on our immune system, susceptibility to certain pathogens.
Interesting. And they tested knocking it out in mice.
They did, and the mice developed pretty normally. Shows it's complex. If absence in humans might have allowed other changes to happen or become more significant.
So we've got this incredibly similar genetic toolkit, yet we end up as very different creatures. How do you get big brains and language from such similar genes? It's a puzzle.
It really highlights that the number of genes isn't the full picture. It's not just the ingredients, it's how they're used, when, where, how much.
That's where Ridley uses that great literary analogy, right? About opening lines of novels.
Exactly. The same words, the genes could be arranged in countless ways to tell vastly different stories, to build vastly different organisms.
It's all about regulation. How the genes are controlled.
Precisely. Gene regulation throwing switches, as Ridley puts it. That's where a lot of the action is.
And he talks about Hox genes. These are ancient, right? Found in flies, mice, us.
Super ancient. Hox genes are like the master architects, laying down the basic body plan, head here, tail there, limbs in the middle. They control other genes involved in development.
And the fact they're so similar across such different animals means that basic body plan is incredibly old.
Hundreds of millions of years old. It was established way back and then tinkered with in different lineages, including ours.
So you don't necessarily need brand new genes to get big evolutionary changes. You can just tweak how the existing ones are used. Ridley mentions promoters.
Promoters are key. They're the DNA sequences right next to a gene that act like dimmer switches or on-off buttons, controlling when and where the gene is active. Changing a promoter can dramatically alter a gene's effect without changing the gene itself.
And gene duplication.
Also crucial. If a gene gets copied, one copy can keep doing the original job, while the other is free to mutate and potentially take on a new role or be expressed in a new way. Humans seem to use their genes in many more contexts than simpler organisms, likely due to these regulatory changes.
It's wild to think that basic animal blueprint is so conserved. Slightly off topic, but related to body plans, Ridley mentions that average human brain size has actually decreased recently.
Yeah, that is a surprising finding over the last, say, 50,000 years or so. Wrangham has this interesting theory. Maybe it's linked to us becoming more domesticated. As societies got more complex, maybe there was less tolerance for highly aggressive types.
So selection favored slightly smaller-brained, more socially compliant individuals.
Yeah, it's a hypothesis. He also discusses the ASPM gene. Mutations there cause microcephaly, a much smaller brain. Shows how critical some genes are for setting overall brain size.
So it all comes back to evolution often working by adjusting the thermostats of existing genes, turning them up or down.
Exactly. And that's central to the nature-nurture interaction. Those thermostats can be influenced by the environment, too.
Which brings us nicely to the environment triggering genetic predispositions. The prairie voles, I love this example. The monogamous ones versus the less committed ones.
The prairie vole's pair bonding is remarkable, and it's linked to having more receptors for oxytocin and vasopressin, those bonding hormones in specific brain areas.
Compared to the montane voles.
Right. And Incel and his team found the key difference wasn't in the receptor genes themselves, but in their promoter regions. Those regulatory switches again.
The prairie voles had different promoters that made more receptors in the right places.
Essentially, yes. And then they did that amazing experiment where they put the prairie vole promoter into mice.
And the mice became more sociable.
They showed more affiliative behavior,
Yeah.
A beautiful demonstration of how changing gene regulation can directly influence complex social behavior.
It really makes you rethink instinct, doesn't it? It's not always just, boom, behavior appears at birth.
Not at all. Instinctive tendencies can develop over time, and they're often shaped by experience. The idea that complex behaviors can't have an instinctive component is just, well, wrong.
Ridley then brings up this interesting paradox. Human differences that are universally similar, like sex differences.
Yeah, we see consistent patterns in certain differences between men and women across very diverse cultures. Things like mate preferences.
Buss's studies, right? Men valuing youth, women valuing resources, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And when those patterns show up consistently across cultures, it strongly suggests there's an underlying biological or instinctive basis, even if culture then shapes and modifies how it plays out.
Some people argued it was just Western bias at first, didn't they?
They did. But Buss expanded his studies globally to dozens of cultures and kept finding similar trends. It suggests nature and nurture often reinforce each other. If there's a slight biological nudge in one direction, culture might amplify it.
This leads us straight into that really intense case study, money versus diamond, a real flashpoint over sex roles.
A pivotal and, frankly, tragic case. John Money strongly believed gender identity was all about upbringing psychosexual neutrality. Milton Diamond argued for a stronger biological basis influenced by prenatal hormones.
And the Reimer twins case became Money's big proof, didn't it? After one twin, David, had that awful circumcision accident, Money convinced the parents to raise him as a girl, Brenda.
Yes. And Money initially published it as a major success, seemingly proving nurture could completely override biological sex. It had a huge impact.
But it wasn't a success at all, was it?
No. Brenda was deeply unhappy, never felt like a girl. Later, as a young adult, David transitioned back to living as a man. It was a harrowing experience, and tragically, he later took his own life.
God, that's awful. It really shows the power of that internal sense of identity, doesn't it?
It strongly suggested the limits of purely environmental explanations for gender
Ah.
identity. It fits with Sandra Scar's idea of niche picking, too. We tend to seek out environments that match our innate tendencies. David's profound discomfort suggests a powerful innate male identity.
So it seems likely that sex differences are, as Ridley says, kind of jump-started by instinct, by biology, even if culture then layers on top.
That seems to be the most plausible interpretation, yeah. Supported by cross-cultural data and cases like the Reimers.
This then connects to Simon Baron-Cohen's theory about systemizing versus empathizing, two different ways of thinking.
Baron-Cohen sees them as distinct cognitive dimensions. Systemizing is about understanding rules, patterns, cause and effect, how things work. Empathizing is about understanding and responding to others' emotions and thoughts.
And he links autism to strong systemizing but weaker empathizing, right?
Generally, yes, it's a
Yeah.
spectrum, of course, but it highlights how we vary along these dimensions.
And this idea of distinct abilities fits with the modular view of the mind.
Exactly. People like Fodor, Tooby, Cosmides, they argue the brain isn't one general processor, but more like a Swiss Army knife, with specialized tools modules for different tasks, like William James's idea of instincts having dedicated brain circuits.
It's funny to contrast that with Plato's ideal republic, where everyone fits a neat role. Aristotle had a more, maybe, realistic view.
Aristotle pushed back a bit. He argued that people need personal rewards, private property, that pure meritocracy without individual incentives might not work because we're more invested in our own stuff, our own families. Motivation matters.
Okay, let's talk about the actual phrase, nature and nurture. Sounds ancient, but Ridley traces its popularization.
Yeah, the debate is ancient, but the phrase itself really took off with Francis Galton in the 1870s. His book, English Men of Science, Their Nature and Nurture.
But didn't Shakespeare use it first? In The Tempest?
He did.
Hmm.
Prospero says of Caliban, a devil, a born devil, on whose nurture can never stick.
Wow.
And even before Shakespeare, an Elizabethan schoolmaster named Richard Mulcaster used it. But Galton really cemented it in the scientific context.
And Galton, doing those early twin studies, leaned heavily towards nature, didn't he? Thinking genius was basically born, not made.
He did. His studies, though maybe crude by today's standards, were influential. Observing identical twins being so similar led him to emphasize heredity over environment, pushing back against the blank slate idea from people like John Locke.
And that really kicked off the whole field of behavior genetics, right? Studying twins, identical, fraternal, raised together, raised apart, and adopted kids to try and tease apart genes and environment.
Exactly. Using these studies to estimate heritability, which is a super tricky concept.
Right, it's often misunderstood. It's not about your individual trait, is it?
No, it's a population statistic. It measures how much of the variation we see in a trait within a specific group can be linked to genetic differences within that group.
Ridley uses the finger number example. We have 10 fingers almost entirely due to genes, but the heritability is near zero.
Because there's almost no variation in finger number in the population. If everyone's the same for a trait, its heritability is zero, even if genes totally determine it.
Then you have Bouchard's Minnesota study. The reunited twins, like the Jim twins, the similarities were just uncanny.
Astonishing, weren't they? Identical twins raised apart, meeting as adults, and finding they drove the same car, smoked the same cigarettes, even vacationed at the same beach.
It really countered the criticisms of earlier twin studies.
It provided really compelling evidence for a significant genetic influence on a whole range of things: personality, IQ, interests, habits.
And Ridley points out it's not just the similarities between identical twins, but also comparing them to fraternal twins.
That's key. Identical twins, 100% shared genes, are consistently more similar than fraternal twins, average 50% shared genes, even when raised in the same house. That difference points strongly to genetics.
But the differences between identical twins also tell us something, right?
Absolutely. Any differences between identical twins must be due to non-shared environmental factors, those unique experiences each twin has, even growing up together, plus some measurement error.
So when you put it all together for something like personality, what do the twin studies generally find?
Roughly speaking, about 40% of the variation seems linked to genes, less than 10% to the shared family environment.
Wow, less than 10% for shared environment. That's surprising.
It surprised many people. Then about 25% is down to that unique non-shared environment, and the rest is likely measurement error.
So those individual experiences outside the home, or perceived differently within the home, really matter for personality.
They seem to matter more than the things siblings typically share, like parental income or general parenting style, at least for personality traits.
Okay, what about specific genes? Ridley mentions the BDNF gene and a tiny variation, valmet.
Yeah, BDNF is important for neuron growth, and this valmet variation is just one DNA letter difference, a single nucleotide polymorphism, or SMP.
And that tiny change is linked to personality differences.
It's been associated with subtle variations, yeah. Things like anxiety levels or memory performance. It shows how small genetic changes can have effects, though linking specific genes to complex traits is really hard.
Especially for something like intelligence or G. It's not like they found the intelligence gene.
Not even close. They've looked at candidate genes like PLP, but mostly it seems intelligence is highly polygenic. Lots and lots of genes, each with a tiny effect, plus environmental factors.
So what's the rough breakdown for intelligence from twin studies?
It's generally estimated around 50% genetic, maybe 25% shared environment, and 25% non-shared environment and error.
So family environment seems more important for IQ than for personality.
It seems so, yes. But there's a crucial twist from Turkheimer's research.
What's that?
He found the heritability of IQ depends heavily on socioeconomic status. In impoverished environments, the heritability is much lower.
Meaning
That in tougher circumstances, the environment might be imposing limits that prevent kids from reaching their genetic potential. The genetic differences don't get a chance to show themselves as much.
wow, that's a powerful interaction. Nature needs the right nurture to flourish.
Exactly. And Ridley suggests maybe some IQ genes don't directly boost intelligence, but affect how much someone enjoys learning. The environment then acts as a multiplier on that enjoyment.
Interesting. Like a gene for curiosity, maybe?
Something like that.
Okay.
A predisposition that leads you to seek out enriching experiences.
Now, Ridley raises this puzzle. Why is there still so much genetic variation? If selection favors the best genes, shouldn't we all be getting more similar?
It's a big question in evolution. Why hasn't natural selection eliminated less advantageous gene versions?
What are the theories?
Several ideas. Maybe selection has relaxed in modern humans. Maybe balancing selection where different versions are good in different situations, or heterozygotes have an advantage. Maybe mate choice keeps diversity high. No single answer seems complete.
It feels like the whole debate often gets stuck in extremes, though.
Totally. People jump to simplistic conclusions. But acknowledging genetic influences is not the same as saying everything is predetermined or that we can't change things. It's not fatalism.
Let's use schizophrenia as a case study. Ridley uses it to show just how complex these interactions are. It's not just genes or environment, is it?
Not at all. Schizophrenia is a prime example of a condition likely needing both genetic vulnerability and environmental triggers. Kraepelin first defined it as dementia praecox.
Early dementia, basically.
Right. Onset in young adulthood, progressive decline. But finding the cause has been incredibly hard because genes and environment seem so tangled up.
Historically, psychoanalysis blamed early childhood, right, bad parenting.
That was dominant for a while, the schizophrenogenic mother idea, sadly. But then twin studies, like Rosenoff's and Kalman's, came along.
And they showed.
Much higher concordance in identical twins than fraternal twins, even when raised apart. That pointed strongly to genetics, not just shared upbringing. The current view is psychosocial factors have a tiny effect on susceptibility unless there's already a genetic predisposition.
So the blame the genes view gained traction from twin, family, and adoption studies. But finding the actual genes has been tough.
Very tough. Linkage studies, which work well for single gene disorders, haven't had much luck pinpointing major schizophrenia genes. It strongly suggests it's polygenic, many genes, small effects.
What about the blame the synapses idea? Dopamine.
The dopamine hypothesis has been influential. Many antipsychotics target dopamine receptors. But linking specific dopamine-related genes directly and consistently to schizophrenia has been tricky.
Have gene expression studies helped, looking at which genes are active?
They've offered clues. Studies show altered activity in genes involved in how neurons signal to each other, like RGS4, or genes on chromosomes 3 and 17. It points towards pathways involved, but not necessarily the root cause genes.
And then there are less mainstream ideas. Viruses. Diet.
Yeah, the idea that dormant retroviruses in our genome, ERVs, could be reactivated by environmental stress, or Horobin's theory about essential fatty acids, EFAs, and brain cell membranes. Some interesting findings, but still needing more solid evidence. Dietary EVA treatments have had mixed results.
So the picture for schizophrenia is Likely many genes creating a vulnerability, plus environmental triggers needed to push someone over the edge.
That seems to be the consensus.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating that its prevalence is pretty similar across cultures worldwide.
And that milder forms, schizotypal traits, are sometimes linked to creativity. Galton noticed that link between genius and insanity ages ago.
It suggests the underlying genetics might be complex, perhaps offering advantages in some contexts or combinations, even while increasing risk for severe illness in others.
Okay, let's shift to the developing brain itself. Ridley calls it nature designed for nurture. What's that mean?
It means our genes don't just build a brain and walk away. They build a brain that's specifically designed to learn from and be shaped by experience. Think of Piaget's ideas about kids actively constructing knowledge through interaction.
And Cachal, the neuroscience pioneer. His idea about nerves growing towards chemical signals.
Ramon Cajal was brilliant. His neuron doctrine, his idea of chemotraction, he figured out that growing nerve fibers, axons, are guided by chemical trails. We now know the molecules, natrins, ephrins, semaphorins, slits, acting as attractants and repellents to wire the brain up.
But it's not just directional cues, is it? There are also badges of identity.
Right. Once an axon gets to the right neighborhood, it needs to find the right house, the right connection. Cell adhesion molecules on the neuron surfaces act like specific identity tags, ensuring they connect to the correct partners.
Kalman syndrome is a good example of how genes affect brain wiring indirectly, isn't it?
Perfect example. It causes loss of smell and delayed puberty because a gene mutation in KAL1 messes up the migration of crucial neurons during development, both olfactory neurons and hormone-releasing ones. The gene isn't for smell or puberty, it's for guiding neuron migration. Shows you can't just say gene for X.
And those cadherins and protocadherins, the binding molecules, there are tons of them.
A huge family. They help neurons stick together and form precise connections. The sheer variety, generated by multiple genes and alternative splicing, making different proteins from one gene, allows for incredible complexity in brain wiring.
Sperry's work challenged the idea that the brain starts as a random mess shaped only by learning, right?
Totally. Sperry's experiments showed nerves have an identity early on and know where they're supposed to go. The basic wiring isn't random, it's genetically guided to a large extent.
But experience is still vital for refining those connections, the kitten experiments.
Hubel and Weisel's classic work. If you deprive one kitten eye of vision during a critical period, the brain circuits for that eye don't develop properly, and the kitten becomes blind in that eye. Sensory input literally sculpts the visual cortex. Even in worms, learning changes gene expression.
And the rat mothering studies. Licking and grooming.
Meady and Francis's work. How much a mother rat licks her pups actually changes the pup's gene expression epigenetically. It affects genes involved in stress response, making them calmer adults. And these effects can last and even be passed on via fostering.
Wow. Nurture literally getting under the skin and changing gene activity.
Exactly. It's a powerful illustration of nature via nurture.
Ridley also mentions prenatal hormones. Ring finger length as a clue to testosterone exposure, and the fraternal birth order effect in homosexuality.
Yeah, suggesting the prenatal environment hormones, maybe even the mother's immune response to male fetuses, can subtly influence development in ways that affect later traits or behaviors. It's complex and often controversial research, but points to early environmental influences.
And imprinting, like Lorenz's geese following him, seems innate, but needs that first sight of mom.
Classic example. The chick is biologically primed to follow a moving object, but that instinct needs an environmental trigger during a critical window. Specific brain areas like the IMHV and neurotransmitters like GABA are involved.
And these critical periods aren't just for geese, right? Language acquisition in humans.
Seems very likely. Those tragic cases of feral children raised in isolation, Victor of Aviron, Jeannie, they struggled massively to learn language later. It suggests a sensitive period where the brain is uniquely ready to soak up linguistic input. It's not just genes, not just learning, but an innate capacity triggered by environment.
Could there be other human imprinting, like Jeannie's fear of dogs?
Possibly. Early traumatic experiences during sensitive periods might leave very deep, almost imprinted fears or associations.
This leads to another fascinating idea, the Westermark effect. Familiarity breeding. Indifference.
Or rather, lack of sexual attraction. Westermark proposed that kids raised together in close proximity during the first few years develop a sexual aversion to each other later, an evolved mechanism to prevent incest, perhaps.
Interesting, because Freud's ideas about repressed desires were becoming dominant then, pushing biological explanations aside.
Exactly. Westermarck's idea, focusing on early social learning shaping later behavior, was a bit against the Freudian grain.
But then Arthur Wolf's study in Taiwan seemed to support it. The Simpua marriages.
Yes, his massive study of these arranged marriages, where the future bride was adopted as an infant and raised with her future husband like a sister. Wolf found these marriages were less fertile, less stable, less sexually satisfying than regular arranged marriages.
Strong evidence for Westermarck. Early co-residence dampened later attraction.
It really looked that way. Nature, the developmental mechanism, requires nurture, the early shared environment, to work. Another clear case of nature via nurture.
Bit ironic that Konrad Lorenz himself married his childhood friend, though.
Yes. Shows it's a tendency, not an unbreakable rule. There are always exceptions.
Okay, let's talk Pavlov. Classical conditioning. We all know the dogs and bells. But Ridley points out something deeper.
Pavlov brilliantly showed how associations are learned connecting a neutral stimulus like a bell with food leads to salivation at the bell alone. But the irony Ridley highlights is that Pavlov, trying to show learning was all external, inadvertently revealed the innate brain mechanisms needed for that learning to happen, like genes involved in memory formation. CRIP genes. Learning itself needs a biological toolkit.
And then Thorndike with consequences shaping behavior, operant conditioning, and Watson taking behaviorism to the extreme. Little Albert.
Watson famously claimed he could shape any infant into anything, purely through environmental control. The Little Albert experiment conditioning fear was iconic, but ethically dubious even then. Behaviorism really emphasized nurture to the exclusion of almost everything else.
And that extreme environmentalism had dangerous real-world consequences sometimes, didn't it? Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union.
A disaster. Rejecting Mendelian genetics for the idea that environmentally acquired traits could be inherited. It crippled Soviet agriculture and science. A stark warning about ideology trumping evidence.
But Ridley argues that recognizing innate influences doesn't have to lead there, right? It doesn't undermine morality.
Not at all. Understanding our biological predispositions doesn't mean we're slaves to them or that we can't be held responsible for our actions. Denying human nature doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes.
Skinner, with radical behaviorism, also downplayed instincts, didn't he?
He did. He saw innate traits mostly as a starting point, quickly overridden by reinforcement history. Less focus on the dynamic interaction we see now.
Then we get Mineka's monkey experiments. Fear of snakes. This is a fantastic example of nature via nurture.
It really is. Lab monkeys aren't born afraid of snakes. Wild monkeys are.
How do the lab monkeys learn it?
By watching other monkeys react fearfully. Even seeing a video of a monkey freaking out at a toy snake makes the lab monkey learn that fear.
But they don't learn to fear flowers the same way.
Right, exactly. They seem biologically prepared to learn fear of certain things, snakes, spiders, much more easily than other things. It's learned, but the readiness to learn specific fears seems innate. Nature provides the template, nurture fills it in.
Ridley also briefly mentions connectionism. What's that about?
It's another perspective on learning, focusing on how networks of simple units, like artificial neural nets, can learn complex patterns and rules from data with minimal pre-programming. More on the empiricist or nurture side of the spectrum, perhaps.
Okay, so moving beyond individual learning, what makes humans as a species so different? Ridley argues it's culture, our ability to accumulate it.
Yes, cumulative culture. The ability to learn from others, build on their knowledge, and pass it down. That's our superpower, arguably. It allows for progress far beyond what any individual could achieve alone.
And culture here isn't just symphonies and art galleries.
No, it's everything. Tools, traditions, languages, social norms, knowledge systems. Ridley mentions Franz Boas, the anthropologist.
Right, working with the Inuit, he really emphasized culture over biology, didn't he? Fought against racism.
Absolutely. Boas stressed that differences between groups were overwhelmingly cultural, not innate biological or racial differences. A hugely important perspective, later backed up by genetics showing more variation within races than between them.
But doesn't cultural change imply some cultures are better or more advanced? That seems tricky for anthropology.
It is tricky. Cultural relativism says understand cultures on their own terms, but clearly some cultures develop technologies or social systems that have massive impacts. Balancing respect for diversity with acknowledging change and adaptation is tough.
But the gap between human culture and animal culture seems vast, even with chimps using tools or macaques washing potatoes.
It does seem vast. Tomasello argues it's down to uniquely human cognitive skills like understanding others' intentions, true imitation, teaching, Mirror neurons might be part of the brain hardware for that.
Ridley even talks about culture genes, genes that enable us to have culture.
Genes involved in brain development, social learning, language, things that create the capacity for culture. FOXP2 is the famous example, linked to speech and language.
Though other animals have FOXP2 too, right?
They do. It's the subtle human-specific changes in FOXP2 and its regulation that seem important for our complex language ability. Language itself, allowing symbolic thought and transmission of complex ideas, was obviously revolutionary for culture.
And Blackmore's memes, ideas competing to spread.
Yeah, the idea that cultural units memes replicate like genes, spreading from mind to mind. Things that are easily learned, remembered, useful, or catchy are more successful memes. Maybe complex grammar itself evolved because it made memes more transmissible. Sexual selection might have played a role too, cleverness or artistry being attractive.
What about that sudden revolution around 50,000 years ago? Cave art, complex tools.
Ridley argues it might be a bit of a Eurocentric myth, or at least less sudden than often portrayed. He suggests a more gradual accumulation, particularly in Africa, driven perhaps by increasing population density, specialization, and trade, the division of labor, as Adam Smith described.
So maybe the key wasn't a massive brain change, but changes in how brains communicated and cooperated. Maybe subtle wiring changes linked to genes like FOXP2.
That's the kind of thing Ridley speculates about, facilitating complex interaction and knowledge sharing.
He also notes the historical appeal and danger of trying to engineer society, communal living attempts, and obviously eugenics.
Yes, the recurring dream of creating a better human through social design or, horrifyingly, selective breeding. Eugenics, fueled by flawed science and prejudice, is a terrible cautionary tale.
Which brings us back to genes and Dawkins' selfish gene idea, still controversial for some.
Yeah. The metaphor is easily misunderstood. It doesn't mean genes have conscious motives or that we are inherently selfish. It means the gene is the level at which natural selection ultimately operates. Genes that build organisms, which successfully reproduce those genes, will spread, even if the behavior looks altruistic.
Like the SRY gene on the Y chromosome triggering male development, it selfishly promotes its own transmission via males.
Exactly. It acts as a unit of selection. This perspective led to sociobiology applying evolutionary thinking to social behavior.
Which caused a huge uproar. Accusations of determinism, justifying inequality.
It did. E.O. Wilson's book sparked massive controversy. Critics worried it was reviving biological determinism and could be used to excuse racism or sexism.
So evolutionary psychology tried to refine it.
People like Tooby and Cosmides emphasized that genes built mechanisms for extracting information from the environment. They aren't fixed programs, they're dynamic, responsive systems. Evolved psychology is about how we process information adaptively, not about predetermined outcomes.
Okay, finally, Ridley wraps up with these paradoxical morals. Socialization, peers, free will.
Yeah, looking at the complexities, like how kids influence parents, not just the other way around. Judith Rich Harris's work emphasizing peer groups over parents in shaping personality.
How kids find their niche within the peer group, specializing.
Exactly. Which connects back to Adam Smith. We tend to enjoy doing what we're good at. It also touches on tricky issues like inherited talents or even looks, and the ethics of that in a meritocratic society.
But he strongly reaffirms that genetic differences within racial groups dwarf the average differences between them. Scientific racism is bunk.
Absolutely. Boas knew it. Lewontin proved it with genetics. Racism persists despite the science, maybe tapping into innate categorization tendencies. But evolutionary psychology argues against innate racism itself, as our ancestors lived in more homogeneous groups.
He mentions the MAOA gene study, too, the warrior gene.
Right, where a variant of the MAOA gene only predicted higher aggression or antisocial behavior in men who had also experienced childhood maltreatment. A classic gene-environment interaction. Shows how vulnerability and experience combine. Raises huge ethical questions, too.
And then the big one, free will. Can we have it if genes and environment shape us?
The ultimate philosophical knot. Philosophers like Spinoza and Kant wrestled with it. Ridley suggests maybe free will isn't about escaping causality, but emerges from the complex, non-linear feedback loops in our brains.
Like Freeman and Walter's ideas, intentions arising from brain dynamics, not a single cause.
Something like that. Your decision to act isn't necessarily a linear chain reaction, but an emergent property of your brain state, influenced by everything: senses, memory, genes, experience. It's why a simple gene defense rarely works in court.
So free will isn't magic, but maybe the sum of all those interacting influences.
That's one way to think about it, the circular causality between genes, brain, experience, and back again.
So wrapping it all up, the big takeaway really is nature via nurture.
Absolutely. Genes aren't destiny. They're designed to absorb experience. They expect and require nurture.
It's this dynamic dance between our biology and our world, especially our culture.
It really challenges that myth of inevitable genetic effects. We're not just puppets of our DNA.
So as you navigate your day, maybe consider that constant interplay. How are your inherent tendencies being shaped right now by the world you interact with? What nurture are you actively seeking out, and how is it, in turn, influencing your nature?